They said he couldn't hear. So they spoke freely about his money, his power, his future, until one woman walked in and said something she thought would die in the room. What he did with her words changed everything. After the accident, Thomas Ferguson never lost consciousness. The world simply stopped responding to him. Machines hummed softly at his bedside, breathing where his lungs no longer seemed strong enough. Heart monitors pulsed in steady rhythm. Doctors spoke in careful, detached voices, confident in their conclusion. Severe head trauma. Deep coma. No meaningful brain response. They were wrong. Thomas heard it all. He heard the doctors discussing timelines. He heard nurses talking about him like a task on a checklist. He heard the subtle shift in tone when someone recognized his name, followed by the sudden politeness, the hushed respect, the quiet curiosity about what would happen to his fortune. But what terrified him most was not the silence of his body. It was the freedom with which people spoke once they believed he was gone. Thomas tried to move. Nothing happened. He tried to open his eyes. Nothing. He tried to scream, to signal, to fight his way back into the world, but his body refused him entirely. His mind, however, was painfully awake. This was not sleep. This was not rest. This was awareness locked inside flesh that no longer obeyed. Within hours, visitors began to arrive. Executives he had trusted with his company whispered about interim leadership. Lawyers debated contingency plans just outside his door. A distant cousin, someone he barely recognized, asked a nurse whether his personal belongings had been secured. They spoke about him as if he were already a memory. Lying there, unable to respond, Thomas felt something crack beneath the weight of it all. He had spent decades building an empire, negotiating, dominating, controlling every room he entered. At 45, he was known as a man who always had leverage. Now he had none. As the hours blurred together, Thomas began to understand a truth he had avoided his entire life. Power could command attention, but it could not buy presence. By the second day, exhaustion seeped into his thoughts. Perhaps this was it. Perhaps this was how his story ended, not with impact, but with quiet erasure. Then the door opened again. Thomas expected another lawyer, another doctor, another voice measuring his worth in numbers. Instead, he heard a softer step, slower, hesitant. A woman spoke, not loudly, not carefully, but kindly. "Hi, I'm just here to help you get settled." Her voice carried no urgency, no entitlement. She explained what she was doing as if he were listening, adjusting sheets, checking equipment, apologizing when her hands were cold. Her name was Amber Robinson. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know what he owned. She didn't know the room she stood in housed a man worth millions. She spoke to him like a person. And in that moment, trapped inside his unmoving body, Thomas made a decision that would change everything. He would stay silent, not because he couldn't speak, but because for the first time in his life, someone was talking without wanting anything in return. Before we begin this story, kindly tell us where in the world you're watching from in the comments. Like, subscribe, and share this story, because some voices are only heard when others choose to listen. Now listen closely. The door closed softly behind Amber Robinson. Her footsteps faded down the hall, leaving behind a stillness that felt heavier than the machines surrounding him. The room returned to its familiar rhythm. Beeps, hisses, the quiet mechanical insistence of life being maintained by things that did not care whether he was present or not. Thomas waited. He did not know what he was waiting for. A miracle. A failure. Proof that what he had felt with Amber was not a hallucination born of desperation. But none of that came. Only time. And with time came voices. They arrived in pairs first. Shoes polished. Voices lowered. The kind of men who knew how to sound concerned without meaning it. Thomas recognized them before they spoke his name. Has there been any change? No. How long are we giving this? A pause. Paper rustled. Someone cleared his throat. The doctors are saying, statistically, the chances aren't encouraging. Statistically. Thomas wanted to laugh. He had built his life on statistics, market probabilities, risk models, forecasts that bent entire industries in his favor. He had trusted numbers more than people because numbers, at least, pretended to be honest. Now they were using them to erase him. They gathered near the window, assuming distance equaled privacy. If he doesn't regain consciousness within the next 72 hours, one of them said, we need to activate the interim plan. Another voice, familiar, measured, once loyal, replied, The board will expect stability. Investors are already asking questions. Of course they are, a third man muttered. Ferguson was the company. Was. Thomas felt the word land like a verdict. They spoke of shares next, of voting rights, of temporary authority that sounded suspiciously permanent. One man, his chief operating officer, a man Thomas had personally mentored, suggested reallocating certain decision-making powers to prevent paralysis. Thomas remembered late nights with that same man, poring over contracts, sharing victories, clinking glasses after hostile takeovers. He remembered telling him, "We win together." Now the man spoke like Thomas was a malfunctioning component in need of replacement. "No one's saying this is forever," the COO added quickly, as if sensing the moral line he was crossing. "Just until we know more." Until we know more. Thomas understood the translation. Until it's safe to move on without you. The lawyers arrived next. They came armed with leather folders and calm expressions. Voices sharpened by years of speaking about people as estates, as risks, as scenarios. They stood at the foot of the bed, not looking at Thomas, but at the chart clipped beside him. "If the condition persists," one said, "we need to consider power of attorney." "There's already language in place for incapacitation," another replied. He planned for this. Thomas almost smiled. He had planned for everything. That was his gift. His curse. "What about control of the holding companies?" someone asked. "That will depend on how long this state continues," the lawyer said. "We can argue temporary authority, but it opens the door to challenges." "From whom?" "Family." The word carried a different weight. Family arrived later that evening. They did not come together. They never did. His sister came first, sharp perfume, clipped heels, eyes that scanned the room before settling on him. She stood close enough to look concerned, far enough to remain detached. She spoke in a whisper meant for the air, not for him. He looked smaller. Smaller. As if power had mass. As if it could evaporate. His brother arrived next, lingering near the doorway like a guest unsure of his welcome. He asked the nurse about prognosis, nodded solemnly, then turned to his sister. "We should talk," he said. They stepped into the hallway, but their voices carried anyway. "What happens if this continues? We'll need to make decisions." "About what?" "About everything." There was a pause. Then, sharper. He wouldn't want things frozen. Thomas almost screamed. He would want control. He had wanted control. He had spent his life tightening his grip on every variable, every person, every outcome. And now they were using his own reputation against him, deciding his intentions without ever asking him. His cousin appeared briefly, asked a nurse about personal effects, then left when there was nothing immediately available. No one held his hand. No one asked him to fight. Later, nurses changed shifts. The night staff spoke more freely, their fatigue loosening the filters professionalism required. "Room 614 still unresponsive," one said while adjusting in 4. "High profile, though." "Yeah, I heard. Billionaire or something." "Figures. They always end up here like everyone else." Like everyone else. They turned him, cleaned him, monitored outputs. Their hands were efficient, impersonal. Not unkind, but not personal either. He was a body. A task. A responsibility. Not Thomas Ferguson. Not the man who had once silenced boardrooms with a glance. As the hours stretched, something inside him shifted. At first, he had been angry, furious at his body, at the injustice, at the betrayal unfolding inches away from him. He had raged internally, replaying conversations, promises, alliances he believed were unbreakable. But anger required energy. And energy, slowly, gave way to clarity. He began to see the pattern he had ignored for decades. People had not followed him out of loyalty. They had followed leverage. They had stayed because he was useful, because proximity to him meant access, protection, advantage. He had confused dependence for devotion, respect for relationship. And now that his voice was gone, now that his power could no longer enforce loyalty, the truth was speaking freely. He was no longer a man. He was a circumstance, a risk, a delay. The contrast was unbearable. He remembered standing at the head of a long table, fingers steepled, deciding the fate of companies, careers, entire families with a sentence. He remembered assistants waiting for his approval, executives rehearsing their words before entering his office, the quiet satisfaction of being needed. Now he needed everything. Air, movement, time. And the world did not pause for him. By morning, Exhaustion wrapped around his thoughts like fog. His mind wandered through memories uninvited, deals won, bridges burned, conversations he had cut short because they did not serve an immediate purpose. How many times had he dismissed people who wanted nothing from him? How many ambers had he walked past without noticing? The irony settled deep. Success had bought him influence. It had not bought him allegiance. And as the room filled once more with voices measuring his worth in documents and projections, Thomas understood the cruelest truth of all. Power does not disappear loudly. It fades in whispers, spoken inches away, by people who no longer need your permission. And he could do nothing but listen. The room had learned how to breathe without him. Machines regulated the rhythm now. Oxygen flowing, monitors pulsing, for fluids dripping with indifferent precision. Time passed in measured intervals marked not by daylight or darkness, but by shift changes and chart updates. Voices came and went, each leaving less of an imprint than the last. Thomas lay within it all, suspended. He had stopped hoping for rescue. Hope required imagining an outcome. What remained was awareness. Sharp, relentless, inescapable. Then the door opened again. Not abruptly. Not with the practiced confidence of doctors or the careful restraint of lawyers. It opened slowly, as if whoever stood on the other side was already thinking about the space they were entering. Footsteps followed. Soft. Measured. Someone exhaled. "Well," a woman said quietly, "let's see how you're doing today." The voice was different. Not because it was gentle, many had spoken gently. Not because it was calm. Calm was a professional requirement here. It was different because it carried no audience. No performance. No assumption that silence meant absence. Thomas felt it immediately. She approached the bed, setting something down on the side table. The sound was unhurried. He imagined tired hands, careful not to make noise where none was needed. "I'm going to adjust your sheets," she said, speaking clearly, as though he were awake. "They tend to bunch up overnight, and that can get uncomfortable." Uncomfortable. The word landed with surprising weight. No one had spoken to him about comfort. Only function. Only metrics. Her hands slid beneath him, lifting just enough to smooth the fabric. They were warm, slightly rough, real. "If anything feels off," she continued, almost apologetically, "I wish you could tell me. But I'll do my best to guess." Guess? Thomas wanted to tell her she was already doing better than anyone else. She checked the foreline next, eyes focused, movements efficient but unhurried. She explained what she was doing without rushing through the words. "This one's been steady," she said. "That's good. No inflammation at the site. Good. Not adequate. Not acceptable. Good." She paused briefly, then reached for a cloth, dampened it, and gently wiped his forehead. "You've been running a little warm," she said. "Nothing serious. Just keeping an eye on it." She did not ask a question. She did not wait for a response. But she spoke as if one mattered. Thomas felt something shift, not in his body, but deeper. Something he had kept rigid for years loosened, just slightly. She moved around the bed, adjusting equipment, checking vitals. Each action carried a quiet attentiveness that suggested long hours and limited rest. Her shoulders dipped occasionally, as if the weight of the day lived there. When she stretched her neck briefly, it was done unconsciously, a reflex rather than a complaint. No sighs of frustration. No comments about workload. Just presence. "My name's Amber," she said suddenly, as if remembering a rule she believed in. "Amber Robinson." She smiled. He could hear it in her voice. "I know you can't answer," she went on, "but it still feels rude not to introduce myself." Rude. The word startled him. No one here had worried about manners. She pulled up a chair, not close enough to crowd him, not far enough to feel distant, and sat while updating the chart. Her pen moved slower than the others. Thoughtfully. "You've got a lot of people checking in on you," she said conversationally. "Must be exhausting." Thomas almost laughed. She had no idea. Her gaze flicked briefly to his face. Not clinical, not assessing, just a look. The kind given to someone you expect might look back. "I'll be back later to check on you again," Amber said, standing. "If you're awake in there. I hope it's not too boring." Boring. He had ruled empires. Negotiated billion-dollar deals. And yet, in this moment, being considered bored felt like recognition. She hesitated at the door. "Oh, and I turned the blinds a little," she added. "Morning light can help with orientation. Or at least, that's what they tell us." They tell us. Not I know. Not protocol demands. Just shared knowledge, imperfect and human. Then she was gone. The door closed softly behind her. The room felt different. Nothing had changed physically. The machines continued their steady work. The bed remained unmoving. His body remained silent. But something fundamental had shifted. For the first time since the accident, Thomas did not feel invisible. She had not asked about his name. She had not glanced at the chart long enough to notice the numbers attached to it. She did not know the weight of his assets, the reach of his influence, the power he once wielded with ease. She had spoken to him anyway, not because she had to, but because she believed he was there. Thomas replayed the interaction again and again, cataloging the differences with the same precision he once used to analyze markets. She spoke to him, not around him. She explained, not assumed. She touched with care, not obligation. And most importantly, she expected nothing in return. No leverage, no benefit, no recognition, just decency. He realized then how rare that had been in his life. How many conversations had been shaped by what people wanted from him. How many smiles calibrated. How many words chosen carefully. How many silences strategic. Amber's were none of those things. Her exhaustion had revealed itself only in the small details. The way she leaned briefly against the counter before standing straight again. The faint hesitation before bending down. The quiet discipline of someone who had learned to keep going without announcing it. She carried no resentment. No performance of sacrifice. Just quiet endurance. As the hours passed, others came and went. Doctors, nurses, a consultant or two. They spoke their language of charts and probabilities, of timelines and outcomes. But their voices blurred. Amber's did not. When she returned later, she greeted him again. "Hi," she said, as if picking up a conversation rather than starting one. "Me again." She adjusted his position, careful and deliberate. "Sorry if my hands are cold," she added. "I should have warmed them first." Sorry. For the first time since waking into silence, Thomas felt something close to certainty. If he ever found his way back, if his body ever obeyed him again, this moment would matter. This woman, who did not know him, who owed him nothing, who saw him not as power or property, but as presence, she had given him something no one else had. Human recognition. And lying there, trapped inside a body that would not respond, Thomas Ferguson made a choice. He would not fight the silence. He would stay inside it a little longer. Because for the first time in his life, being unheard had revealed someone who spoke without asking for anything in return. And that, he sensed, was the beginning of something far more dangerous than power. Amber came back just after noon. Thomas knew the hour not by the clock on the wall, but by the quality of the light. It slanted differently then, less sharp, more forgiving. The room warmed as the sun climbed, and the machines seemed to soften their insistence, as if even they respected the rhythm of the day. She entered with the same quiet awareness as before, nudging the door closed with her foot while her hands balanced a tray. "Hey," she said gently, like they had an understanding. "I brought the good wipes this time. The ones that don't feel like sandpaper." She set the tray down and washed her hands, humming something under her breath. It was off-key and unpolished, the kind of sound people make only when they believe no one is listening. Thomas listened. "I've got about 10 minutes before things get wild again," Amber said, drying her hands. "So we'll make it count." "We." The word wrapped around him. She adjusted his pillow, checked his vitals, spoke through each step as if narrating a shared task rather than performing a duty. "Everything's steady," she said. "You're behaving today." There was a pause, then a small smile in her voice. "I wish I could say the same about the rest of my life." She did not laugh afterward. She did not wait for sympathy. The words simply existed, suspended between them. She pulled up the chair again, sat, and exhaled slowly. "You're probably the only one who won't interrupt me," she said, almost to herself. And then she talked. Not all at once. Not like a confession. More like someone emptying pockets at the end of a long day, one small thing at a time. "My son starts kindergarten next month," she said. "I'm excited for him. Terrified for me." She smoothed the blanket absent-mindedly as she spoke. "Childcare costs more than my rent," Amber continued. "And school hours don't exactly line up with hospital shifts. So I'm still trying to figure out how that's supposed to work." She shrugged. "I will. I always do." Thomas felt the weight of that sentence. She spoke of mornings that started too early, of lunches packed while half asleep, of bedtime stories read through exhaustion. She mentioned the way her son insisted on the same book every night, the one with the dog who gets lost and finds his way home. He makes me read it even when I'm running late, she said. Says the dog won't sleep if I don't finish the last page. Her voice softened there. So I finish it. She smiled briefly, then stood to adjust a monitor, her movements fluid despite the hours etched into her posture. People think being tired is the hardest part, she went on. It's not. She returned to the chair. It's being invisible. The words settled heavily in the air. Everyone needs something from you, Amber said. Patients, supervisors, family. But no one really sees you. Not the part of you that's just trying. Thomas understood that language intimately. They assumed things, she continued. That I made bad choices. That I should have planned better. That if I just worked harder, it wouldn't feel like this. She shook her head slightly. Harder than what? She didn't sound angry. Just tired. Honest. I talk to people all day, Amber said. But no one actually hears me. Not really. Thomas felt the irony press against him. A woman with a voice the world ignored, speaking to a man who could hear everything and answer nothing. When Amber stood again, she rubbed her wrists absent-mindedly, rolling them once, twice, before continuing her tasks. The gesture was small, but it carried the quiet ache of repetition. I know this probably sounds silly, she added. Talking like this. She glanced at him, not searching for validation, not expecting a response. But it helps. Pretending someone's listening. Pretending. Thomas wanted to reach for her hand, to tell her she wasn't pretending at all. Over the next few days, the pattern continued. Amber came when she could, sometimes only for minutes, sometimes long enough to sit and breathe. She talked about bills that never seemed to shrink, about choosing between overtime and sleep, about the way her son asked why she was always tired, and how she laughed it off even when it hurt. I don't want him to think life is just surviving, she said once. But some days, that's all I've got. Her honesty was unpolished. There were no agendas hidden in her words, no careful positioning, no leverage being sought. Thomas contrasted it instinctively with the voices that had surrounded him before, the strategizing, the subtle maneuvering, the careful omissions. People who spoke in order to gain. Amber spoke to release. He found himself waiting for her, not consciously at first, but when hours passed without her voice, the room felt colder, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound. When she returned, something in him settled. He began to measure time by her visits. Morning light meant Amber might come. Afternoon shadows meant she might not. Night shifts brought uncertainty. Once, she arrived later than usual, eyes rimmed with fatigue, movements slower. Rough day, she said simply. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. She sat beside him for a moment longer than usual, hands folded, staring at nothing. You know, she said quietly, sometimes I think if I disappeared, it would take weeks before anyone noticed. Except my kid. She stopped herself then, inhaled sharply. Sorry, she said. That was too much. Too much. Thomas wished she knew how little it was compared to what he carried. As she stood to leave, she paused. I'll be back tomorrow, Amber said. Same time if I can. If I can. The phrase carried the weight of 1,000 obligations. After she left, Thomas lay alone with the echo of her words. For the first time since the accident, he did not replay conversations of power lost or control stripped away. He replayed her voice instead. Her stories. Her quiet resilience. He realized something then, slowly, carefully. He was no longer waiting to be heard. He was listening. And in that listening, something unexpected took root. Not hope. Not yet. But anticipation. In a world that had reduced him to silence, Amber Robinson had given him a voice meant for no one to hear. And it was the only one that mattered. Amber arrived near the end of her shift that night. The hallway outside Thomas's room had quieted into something close to reverence, the kind that comes not from peace, but from exhaustion. The day staff had gone. The night crew moved with the economy of people conserving energy for a long stretch ahead. Amber slipped in without turning on the overhead light, letting the glow from the monitors do the work. Hey, she said softly. Didn't want to wake you. Not that I know if you're asleep. She smiled to herself, washed her hands, and leaned against the counter for just a second longer than usual before straightening. Thomas noticed the pause, the way she closed her eyes briefly, as if collecting herself before continuing. I don't usually talk this much, she said, checking his chart. I promise. She didn't sound apologetic. She pulled the chair close again, sat, and rested her forearms on her knees. The posture was different tonight, less professional, more human, like someone choosing honesty instead of silence. I had a patient earlier, Amber began. Middle-aged, well-dressed. Everyone listened when he spoke. She adjusted the blanket as she talked, smoothing a crease that didn't matter. He snapped his fingers at me, she said matter-of-factly. Told me I was taking too long. She paused. I was standing right there. Thomas felt something tighten inside him. I corrected him, Amber continued. Politely. Professionally. He didn't even look at me when he apologized. Just spoke in my direction. She didn't sound angry. She sounded certain. People don't see women like me until something goes wrong, she said quietly. The sentence hung between them, heavy but unadorned. I don't mean just here, Amber added. I mean everywhere. She leaned back slightly, gaze unfocused. They see me when they're scared, when they're in pain, when they need something. But once things are stable, I disappear again. She shrugged. That's how it works. Not resignation. Recognition. I've learned to live with it, she went on. You grow a kind of radar. You notice the assumptions before they're spoken. She ticked them off without bitterness. That I'm not in charge. That I don't know what I'm doing. That I must be new. Or temporary. Or replaceable. Her voice remained steady. I've had people ask me to get the real nurse. Ask me if I'm lost. Ask me who I'm covering for. She glanced at Thomas, as if checking whether the words were landing somewhere. I've stopped correcting them most days, she said. It's not worth the energy. Energy. Thomas remembered how easily he had spent it, demanding, commanding, reshaping rooms around his presence without ever noticing who disappeared when he entered. Amber rested her hands in her lap. I don't want pity, she said. I don't even want recognition. She looked down at her fingers. I just want to exist without having to prove I deserve to be in the room. The silence that followed was different from the others. It was full. Thomas felt something shift again, deeper than before. Not a crack this time, but a turn. He saw his past with an unforgiving clarity. Boardrooms filled with voices he had trained himself to hear, and the ones he had filtered out. Assistants whose names he never learned. Staff who kept systems running while he took credit for efficiency. Women whose competence he assumed instead of acknowledged. People whose labor formed the floor he stood on. He had called it focus. He had called it leadership. He had called it efficiency. But it had been blindness. He remembered walking through offices without looking up, interrupting, speaking over, making decisions that landed hardest on people he never met. People like Amber. Not because he hated them, because he never saw them. The realization did not come with shame alone. It came with weight. Amber stood to check a monitor, her movements slower now, as if the conversation had cost her something. She didn't dramatize it. She simply continued. I tell myself it's fine, she said. That my son sees me. That's enough. She smiled faintly. But some days, I wonder how many people walk past me without ever knowing I'm here. Thomas wanted to tell her, I see you. But the words stayed trapped where all his others were. Still, something inside him answered. He was no longer listening as a passive witness. He was listening as someone implicated. Amber gathered her things, preparing to leave. Anyway, she said lightly, shifting the tone without erasing what had been said. That was heavier than I meant to get. She stood at the foot of the bed, adjusting the sheet one last time. You're doing okay tonight, she added. Steady, steady. She paused, then said something softer. Thanks for listening. The door closed behind her. Thomas lay alone in the dim room, the machines keeping time. He understood now that the silence trapping him was not new. He had lived inside a different version of it his entire life. One padded by power. One that allowed him to choose what to hear and what to ignore. That silence had protected him. This one was teaching him. And somewhere in the quiet, without moving a muscle or speaking a word, Thomas Ferguson crossed a threshold. Not back into power, but into awareness. The kind that cannot be undone. Thomas discovered the truth in fragments. It began as a flicker, not of light, but of sensation. A faint awareness at the edges of his body, like a limb remembered rather than felt. Then pressure, then something close to resistance. His fingers, they were still his. He could not move them freely, not yet, but when he concentrated, when he focused with the same discipline he once used to bend markets, something answered. Not much. Just enough to confirm what he had been afraid to hope. He was not as trapped as he had believed. The realization should have ignited urgency. Panic. a desperate need to break free. Instead, it brought fear. Because with movement came consequence. With awakening came noise. Doctors would rush in. Monitors would spike. Phones would ring. Lawyers would return. Executives would reclaim their places at his bedside. Voices suddenly reverent again. Apologies rehearsed. Loyalty rediscovered. And Amber would change. Not intentionally. Not cruelly. But inevitably. She would learn his name. She would see the chart differently. The room would no longer hold a man. It would hold him. Thomas Ferguson. The weight would shift. The honesty would recalibrate. The voice meant for no one to hear would disappear. Amber arrived mid-morning. Thomas knew before she spoke. He had learned her rhythm. The soft click of the door. The pause before the light. The way she exhaled as if stepping into a different version of herself. "Morning," she said quietly. "I was hoping I'd catch you today." Today? She checked his vitals, humming again. The tune was different this time, but the habit remained. Her hands were steady, practiced. When she adjusted his arm, his skin tingled where she touched him. The sensation startled him. He could feel more now. Amber noticed nothing. "I've got a short shift," she said, "but I wanted to check in." She pulled up the chair, sat, and rubbed her eyes briefly with the heel of her hand. Not enough to complain, just enough to reset. "My son asked me yesterday what I do all day," she said, smiling faintly. "I told him I help people feel less scared." She laughed softly. He said, "Do you help them talk?" Her voice caught for half a second. "I said sometimes." Thomas felt the weight of the word. Sometimes. She leaned back, folding her arms loosely. "You know," Amber said, "I don't think people realize how much truth they tell when they think no one's listening." Thomas held his focus on his fingers. He could try. Just a twitch. A sign. A movement small enough to test the boundary. But he didn't. Because if he crossed it, there would be no going back. Amber continued. "I used to think honesty needed an audience," she said. "That if no one responded, it didn't count." She shrugged. "Now I'm not so sure." She stood to adjust a setting on the monitor. Thomas concentrated again, feeling the faint resistance, the possibility waiting just beneath the surface. Truth or comfort? Action or listening? Freedom or connection? He had spent his life choosing action, choosing control, choosing outcomes. This was the first time silence felt like a choice instead of a punishment. Amber returned to the chair. "I don't know why I tell you all this," she admitted. "You're just here. Just here." Thomas understood something, then that unsettled him more than any loss of power. She trusted the silence. Not because it belonged to him, but because it asked nothing from her. If he woke, that trust would fracture. The space would change shape. Her words would become careful again. Measured. Polite. Filtered. And he was not ready to lose that. The conflict tightened inside him. He wanted truth. The truth of movement, of reclaiming his voice, of stepping back into the world. But he wanted this too. The rare gift of being present without expectation. Amber stood to leave. "I'll come back later," she said. "If I can." She always said that. As the door closed, Thomas let the effort drain from his mind. The sensation faded, retreating like a tide pulled back by gravity. He had chosen. Not forever. Not yet. But deliberately. He would remain silent. Not because he couldn't speak, but because in silence, he had found something he had never earned with power. And the longer he stayed, the higher the cost of leaving became. The stakes were no longer corporate. They were human. And for the first time, Thomas Ferguson was afraid, not of being trapped, but of being heard. The first sign came in the voices. They returned with purpose now, measured, clipped, efficient. No longer speculative. No longer circling. Decisions had replaced deliberation. Thomas recognized the tone immediately. Finality. Two administrators stood near the foot of his bed, tablets in hand, badges catching the overhead light. They spoke quietly, but not carefully. The room, to them, was no longer occupied. "We can't justify acute care much longer," one said. "He's stable, but non-responsive." "The board has been patient," the other replied. "But resources are resources." Long-term facility? Yes. Specialized. Out of state, most likely. Out of state. The words rang louder than any alarm. They discussed timelines, bed availability, transport logistics, the kind of language that dissolved a person into a process. "Once the transfer happens, his current care team will rotate off," one added. "Continuity won't be possible." Continuity. Thomas understood the cost of that word immediately. Amber would not come with him. Later that day, the executives arrived again, fewer this time, but more confident. Papers had become folders. Folders had become decisions. "We'll formalize the interim structure," the COO said, standing too close to the window. "No reason to wait." Another nodded. "Investors prefer clarity." "Permanent clarity," someone else corrected. No one objected. Thomas listened as power shifted hands without resistance. His absence had become permission. The empire he had built was no longer being guarded. It was being claimed. Amber came in that evening. Thomas knew something was different before she spoke. Her steps were slower. Her voice, when it came, carried hesitation. "Hey," she said softly. "Sorry I'm late." She washed her hands, then stood still for a moment longer than usual, watching the monitors as if they might explain something she hadn't been told outright. "They've been talking," she said finally. "Talking." She adjusted his pillow, careful, deliberate. "About moving you," Amber continued. "Somewhere more long-term." Her mouth tightened slightly, not in anger, but concern. "I won't be part of the next rotation," she said. "Different staff, different schedules." She tried to sound neutral. She failed. Thomas felt time collapse inward. He focused again, instinctively, feeling for the faint resistance in his fingers. It answered, subtle, patient, waiting. He could stop this. If he woke now, everything would change. The move would pause. The plans would scramble. His voice would return. And Amber would know. She pulled the chair closer than usual and sat. "I don't normally say this," she said, "but I'm going to miss you." The words landed with quiet force. "You've been easy," she added, searching for the right word. "In a place where nothing is." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I don't know if that makes sense." It made perfect sense. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "I talk to you because it feels safe," Amber said. "Like the words won't be twisted or used or weighed." She looked down at her hands. "I don't get that a lot." Thomas felt the urgency surge. This was the moment. The choice was no longer theoretical. Silence now meant loss. Amber stood, straightened the blanket, and hesitated. "I hope wherever you go," she said quietly, "someone talks to you like you're still here." The room felt smaller after that. The machines continued their steady rhythm, indifferent to the countdown now ticking inside Thomas. Administrators would return tomorrow. Paperwork would be signed. Transport scheduled. Amber would stop coming. The silence he had chosen would become permanent, not by choice, but by distance. Thomas gathered himself. The truth and the comfort stood on opposite sides now, no longer able to coexist. And as the night settled over the hospital, time slipping through him like water through open hands, Thomas Ferguson understood something with absolute clarity. Waiting was no longer neutral. It was a decision with consequences. And the clock had started. Amber came just before dawn. Thomas knew because the light was wrong. Too pale, too early, the sky still undecided about becoming morning. The hospital moved differently at that hour. Quieter, but not calm. Like a place holding its breath. The door opened slowly. Amber stepped inside and closed it behind her with care. "Hey," she said softly. Her voice was steady, but something underneath it had changed. It carried finality, not dramatic, not heavy-handed, just honest. The kind that doesn't ask permission. She didn't turn on the overhead light. She didn't check the chart right away. She came straight to the bedside. "I'm not technically assigned to you today," Amber said, "but I wanted to stop by before I go." Before I go. Thomas felt the words land like a hand pressed against his chest. She stood there for a moment, just looking at him. Not assessing, not measuring, just seeing. "They're moving you this afternoon," she said quietly. "Long-term care. Different place. Different people." She exhaled slowly. "I won't be there." Thomas gathered everything he had. The faint resistance was stronger now. His body felt closer, like a door that had been locked but not sealed. The effort it would take terrified him. Not because it was impossible, but because it was irreversible. Amber pulled the chair closer and sat. "I know you can't hear me," she said. The words struck harder than any diagnosis. "But I still want to say this out loud." She folded her hands together, knuckles whitening briefly before relaxing again. "Talking to you changed something for me," Amber continued. "I didn't realize how much I needed to say things without being corrected, or doubted, or reduced." She smiled faintly. "You never interrupted me, never looked past me, never made me feel small." Thomas felt panic rise. He tried. Nothing. Amber leaned forward. I don't know who you are, she said gently, or who you were before all this. She shook her head. But I know who you were to me. Her voice wavered for the first time. You were proof that I exist even when no one's watching. The room seemed to tighten around them. Amber stood. I hope someone sees you wherever you're going, she said. The way I saw you. She reached out, hesitated, then rested her hand lightly on his forearm. The contact grounded him. This was it. If he stayed silent now, the story would end this way. Unfinished, unreturned, her truth spoken into a void that never answered. Thomas focused everything he had left. Not on power, not on fear, on her. His fingers twitched. Just barely. Amber froze. She stared at his hand, then at his face, uncertainty flickering across her features. She whispered. That's probably just a reflex. Thomas pushed harder. Pain flared, white, consuming, real. His fingers moved again. This time, unmistakably. Amber stood so fast the chair scraped loudly across the floor. Oh my God, she breathed. She leaned closer, eyes searching his face. Can you? Her voice broke. Can you hear me? Thomas pulled air into lungs that felt foreign, stiff, unwilling. His throat burned. His tongue felt too large, his mouth uncooperative. The effort was brutal, but he forced it anyway. Yes. The word came out hoarse. Broken. Barely there. But it existed. Amber staggered back a step, hand flying to her mouth. Oh my, she laughed, half sob, half disbelief. Your footsteps thundered in the hallway. Alarms began to sound. Someone shouted. Doctors rushed in. Nurses followed. The room filled with motion, voices overlapping, commands snapping into place. Sir, can you hear me? Mr. Ferguson, squeeze my hand. Amber stood frozen near the wall, forgotten in the sudden chaos. Thomas turned his head, slowly, painfully, toward her. It took everything. I heard you, he said. The room went silent. Not the clinical quiet of monitored stability. A different kind. Amber's breath caught audibly. He held her gaze. Every word. Something in her face collapsed. Years of invisibility giving way all at once. She covered her mouth, tears spilling freely now, unrestrained. I wasn't pretending, she whispered. No, Thomas said. You were never pretending. Doctors resumed speaking. Faster now, louder, but the moment had already happened. Power had shifted, not back to him, but away from everything that had kept them both unseen. Amber stepped forward again, unafraid now. I talked to you because I thought no one could hear me, she said. Thomas swallowed. You talked, he replied, because you deserved to be heard. The machines continued their steady rhythm. But nothing in that room was the same. Because a man without a voice had finally spoken, and a woman the world overlooked had finally been answered. Recovery did not arrive as a miracle. It arrived as work. Thomas woke into a world that wanted him back immediately. Voices sharpened with urgency, apologies delivered too quickly, hands eager to reattach themselves to relevance. Doctors explained timelines. Specialists outlined possibilities. Lawyers waited just outside the door, careful not to crowd him this time. He listened, truly listened. And for the first time, he chose silence where it mattered. When he was strong enough to sit upright, strong enough to speak without the effort burning through his chest, Thomas asked for records. Not medical, administrative, visitor logs, meeting notes, internal emails routed through hospital systems, conversations he had heard fragments of, now confirmed in full, the succession plans, the quiet power grabs, the urgency with which his absence had been converted into opportunity. He did not rage. He did not confront. He thanked them. Then he removed them. Executives who had treated his silence as permission found their authority dissolved with calm efficiency. Interim roles ended quietly. Contracts were restructured. Shares redistributed. No scandals. No headlines. Just absence. The kind they had once assigned to him. Thomas returned to his company briefly, not to reclaim control, but to dismantle the version of it that had required him to be omnipresent to function. He shifted ownership into employee trusts, restructured profits into long-term community investments, built governance systems that could not be hijacked by proximity to power. He did not announce it. He did not brand it. The initiatives launched without his name attached, funding childcare for hospital workers, education grants routed through community boards, healthcare access expanded quietly, sustainably. No ceremonies. No plaques. Power, he had learned, did not need to be visible to be real. Amber Robinson declined the first offer. And the second, I don't want charity, she said plainly when they spoke again. This time across a small table in a neutral room, daylight between them, no machines filling the silence. Thomas nodded. I wouldn't offer it, he replied. What he offered instead was structural. Flexible scheduling written into policy. Childcare support standardized, not exceptional. Promotions based on competency, not proximity. Listening mechanisms that did not require someone to raise their voice to be heard. Amber accepted that, not as a favor, as acknowledgement. They did not speak often after that. They didn't need to. When they did, it was without ceremony, without imbalance. Two people who had met in silence and chosen not to distort it with obligation. There was no romance, no debt, only recognition. The last time Thomas visited the hospital, it was unannounced. He stood in the hallway where he had once been wheeled past, invisible, listening. The space looked smaller now, not because he was larger, but because he understood it differently. Amber passed him near the nurse's station, a chart tucked under her arm. She stopped when she saw him. Hey, she said. Hey, he replied. No gratitude demanded, just presence. They stood there for a moment, equal in the quiet. Then a call light flashed down the hall. Amber nodded once. I should go. Of course, Thomas said. She turned, then paused. You know, she said lightly, I still talk to some patients who can't answer. Thomas smiled, not broadly, not proudly. I hope you always do. She returned the smile, then walked away. Thomas did not follow. He didn't need to. Some stories end with noise. This one ended with stillness, with two lives no longer invisible to themselves, and a truth learned too late to be heroic, but early enough to matter. My brother said this channel would never grow, that stories like this don't matter anymore. If this story moved you, even quietly, prove him wrong. Subscribe, like, share this story. Let's see how many voices silence doesn't erase.